Our gospel today comes from Luke chapter 15. Now, all the tax collectors and sinners were coming near to listen to Jesus. And the Pharisees and the scribes were grumbling and saying, "This fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them." So Jesus told them this parable. There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, "Father, give me the share of the property that will belong to me." So the father divided his property between the sons, and a few days later the younger son gathered all he had and traveled to a distant country, and there he squandered his property in dissolute living. When he had spent everything, a severe famine took place throughout that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed the pigs. He would gladly have filled himself with the pods that the pigs were eating, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, "How many of my father's hired hands have bread enough and to spare? But here I am dying of hunger. I will get up and go to my father, and I will say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired hands.' So the son set off and went to his father. But while he was still far off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. His father ran and put his arms around him and kissed him. Then the son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his slaves, 'Quickly, bring out a robe, the best one, and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Get the fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' And they began to celebrate. Now the father's eldest son was in the field, and when he came and approached the house, he heard music and dancing. He called one of the slaves and asked what was going on, and the slave replied, 'Your brother has come, and your father has killed the fatted calf because he got him back safe and sound.' Then the elder son became angry and refused to go in. His father came out and began to plead with him. But he answered his father, 'Listen, for all these years I have been working like a slave for you, and I have never disobeyed your command, yet you have never given me even a young goat so that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours comes back, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fatted calf for him.' Then the father said to him, 'Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. But we had to celebrate and rejoice because this brother of yours was dead and has come to life. He was lost and has been found.'" The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
You may be seated. Now all the tax collectors and sinners were coming near to listen to Jesus, and the Pharisees and the scribes were grumbling and saying, "This fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them." What a scandal! Jesus hears them grumbling and tells them 3 parables, actually. That's why we skip a few verses in our reading today. But the 3rd parable that we have is one of those well-known stories that Jesus tells, the parable of the prodigal son. And I have often found myself in my life relating more to the prodigal son who walks away. I spent a big chunk of my life, 8 years, without faith, without really knowing or understanding God's love for me. When we walk away, when we are able to see God's gift of love not in our own lives, when we lose sight of that forgiveness and grace and life that we're giving, we aren't always walking away on purpose, right? We don't say, "Oh, this is terrible. We don't usually say, oh, I don't want to have anything to do with God. Usually it has to do with some kind of hurt by a church, some kind of calling to something else. The son in this story isn't hateful towards his father. He's not walking away because he doesn't want to be with his family. He's traveling out into the world to live a life that he thinks he wants. Sometimes we find ourselves walking away from God even when we know how much good God gives to us. And sometimes we don't even realize that we're walking away. It's a slow drift. And before we know it, we wonder when we find ourselves feeling empty, feeling drained, feeling like we're missing something and we're not sure what it is. In Jesus' parable, the son realizes that he has missed something pretty big. Once he's spent all the money that he has and is trying to feed himself, trying to work for food, but still not getting enough, he needed to fill his stomach, but also to be back in that relationship, in that reconciled community with his family. And he begins to reminisce about the good old days when he was with his father, how generous and kind his father was, that his father's hired hands would never be hungry the way he was hungry. And the son remembers that not only did his father give him what he needed and asked for, but also even above and more. His father gave him the request of his inheritance, which, by the way, basically means that he was telling his father, hey, you're as good as dead to me. Let me have what is mine. And so he knows, the son knows, that he has made a pretty big mistake. And so when he decides to return to beg his father for forgiveness, he plans out this entire speech, right? He practices it even in our scripture today. He believes that he might be able to earn back his father's grace by working as a servant on his father's land. And just like him, we are often the children who think that we can earn our divine parents' love. We often think we can earn God's love. We want to do it ourselves. We struggle because the reality is that that is not how God's love works, right? God's love isn't something that we can earn or make happen. The cross is something that God does for us, whether we can appreciate it or understand it or even pray or think about it. God is the parent who does so much and still rejoices in us. Like the father of the prodigal son, God doesn't want us to work to earn God's love. God just wants to give it to us. Not for God's sake, but for our sake. And so with the son's whole speech planned, he comes back, and before he can even get down the driveway, his father sees him and is filled with compassion. We are often those children who need forgiveness when we walk away, when we drift away, when we squander our gifts. And God is that father in the drive, running to us, ready to give us that big reconciling hug, pulling us back together again. God is the parent who forgives us before we can even ask and celebrates our coming home. And like God's son who is dead and is alive again, we are made alive again in Christ. We are those children waiting to hear those words, to be celebrated and loved. And sometimes when we hear this story, we're not the prodigal son. Sometimes we're the elder son who's been working hard for years. Sometimes we're finding ourselves grumbling, standing outside, refusing to come in to the celebration because it just doesn't seem fair. But God's fairness has never been quite like the fairness we understand as humans. We are those children who struggle. We struggle with how God's reconciling love can really be for all, especially when there are plenty of people who we know don't deserve it. We've had this conversation multiple times in our weekly Bible studies, talking about some of the people in the world who have done the most terrible things, and trying to comprehend that even they are children of God. Even Vladimir Putin, baptized child of God. Well, that just doesn't seem fair. Whenever I hear this story, and whenever we talk about God's fairness and that kind of love, I always kind of travel back in one of those flashback memory times to being a young kid in the car with my two younger sisters. We were driving to my grandma's house. So we lived over in Lake Tapp. She lived in Normandy Park, Burien area. So when you're like 8, 9 years old, that hour drive seems like eons. And, you know, 3 young girls in the back of the car can get a little unruly. And so we were always told if we were really, really, really good, and if we were very, very good at grandma's, on the way home, we would stop at McDonald's and get a Happy Meal. And so I remember that we were halfway home one day and we were getting closer to that exit for McDonald's. I could almost see the big yellow M, and I was like, I'm ready, okay. And so as I'm sitting here, like, just, you know, when you're small and you're hungry, it's the end of the world. You're starving. And my youngest sister, Heidi, starts kicking me. And to be fair, she was probably like 2 or 3, but still, her little feet were knocking against mine as she giggled, and as I just found myself fuming with anger. But I wanted McDonald's. I wanted my chicken nuggets, and she would not take those from me. So I tried to use my big girl words, and I asked her very nicely to please stop, and she didn't. She began laughing, and of course kicking harder, because that's very fun. Toddlers are not known for listening to big girl words. So then I tattled, and I said, Mom, Heidi won't stop kicking me. And my mom turned her head and told Heidi to stop. I think there was probably that moment of, do you need me to turn this car around, or I'll stop this car right now? One of those lines that we hear so often. And Heidi did stop for about 30 seconds, and eventually I gave up because I thought that I would be rewarded for my good behavior, and little baby Heidi would be punished. I had a righteous sense of justice and fairness even at that age, and when we got to McDonald's, my mom put in the order at the drive-thru, and when I heard her say enough Happy Meals for all 3 of us, I broke down. My little 8-year-old body went into full tantrum mode. I was doing far more than just grumbling like the Pharisees. I was screaming, don't let Heidi get anything. She was bad. She kicked me the whole time, didn't stop when you told her to. She shouldn't get a Happy Meal. She shouldn't get anything. And in the drive-thru line, my parents looked at each other and let out a mutual sigh. My mom looks back at me and she says, well, Heidi has to eat too. We're not stopping anywhere else. My whole brain just, what? Well, why did they bother to behave if it didn't matter? I could have been pushing her back, and I still would have gotten McNuggets. I wanted their love and care, for all of that to be completely fair. I wanted a sense of justice for Heidi's misbehavior. But like God's love for each and every one of us, the love and care my parents had for myself and my sisters wasn't something that we could actually earn. We all had McNuggets. I'm still mad about it, can you tell? But the truth is, we are all the sinners and tax collectors that Jesus ate with. We're all the Pharisees who grumble about fairness, We are all the children who just want the kind of justice in the world that we dream of. And we're all the children who hunger and need to be fed, need to be forgiven. God is that parent who sends a son into the world to bring around a new kind of fairness, one that isn't about what we deserve, but is about what we need. Jesus goes to the cross to wrap us in God's arms of reconciliation and joy and celebration, to gather us all in together. Jesus dies and rises from the dead so that we can celebrate this new life where all are fed. God rejoices when we find ourselves stumbling home so that Christ might shower us with that kind of mercy and love. So that together we can see God's fairness, God's justice, God's call to us, and calling us together into those strong and comforting arms. So that, like me and my sisters, whether we like it or not, we are all filled. Thanks be to God. Amen.